good afternoon, and I want to thank our experts and all of the members and staff on the call today for your work to secure a brighter future for our nation's children. In 2013, oppressive child labor practices should be a lesson taught in American history, but not an ongoing crisis in the United States. But regrettably, recent reporting has demonstrated that children continue to lose their lives and suffer devastating injuries because they work in hazardous jobs. Over 85 years after the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, we've seen an alarming increase in child labor violations. According to the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, the number of children employed in violation of child labor laws has nearly quadrupled since 2015, and the number of children illegally employed in dangerous jobs has almost doubled in that same time. Instead of learning and growing, these children struggle to keep up in school, and they suffer burns and disabled injuries working in meatpacking plants, auto parts factories, and other places, according to public reports. This rise in child labor violations is occurring at a time when federal worker protection agencies remain starved for resources. For example, the Wage and Hour Division has been forced to cut personnel hours spent on child labor enforcement every year since fiscal 2017. Additionally, GOP state legislators across the country are actually working actively to roll back essential child labor protections. At least 10 states have introduced or passed laws rolling back child labor protections in the past 2 years. Republican members of our own committee have been silent on holding a hearing to address the abuse of child labor. And that's why I worked with Representative Alma Adams, the subcommittee chairman on worker protections, to introduce the Protecting Children Act. This is the most robust proposal yet to renew our commitment to ending oppressive child labor. It toughens penalties for child labor violations, unsafe workplaces, and workplace injuries and deaths experienced by young workers. It helps prevent the sale and movement of goods produced in violation of child labor laws, expands the capacity for enforcement research and data, improves the process for updating child labor rules and prohibiting any future weakening of those rules, and helps keep policymakers and the public informed about child labor enforcement and trains young workers on their rights. And I want to recognize and commend Democratic members, including Representative Shulkin, Kildee, Kesar, DeLauro, Ruiz, and Grijalva, for sponsoring important legislation related to child labor. So simply put, it's imperative that we strengthen child labor laws and ensure that there are serious consequences for endangering children on the job. So thank you. Thank you all for being with us today and showing your commitment to protecting children. Today, we'll hear from Sally Greenberg, who is the CEO of the National Consumers League and chair of the Child Labor Coalition. The National Consumers League has led the fight against child labor since 1899. And its New York branch was the base of operations for none other than Francis Perkins, who would go on to become President Roosevelt, Secretary of Labor, and one of the architects of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which has just had its 85th anniversary. Then we'll hear from Margaret Wurth, senior researcher at the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. We had the opportunity to hear from her last year at a hearing on agricultural work, and we're happy to have her back. So we'll start with Ms. Greenberg. Tell us what we need to know. Thank you for being with us.
And thank you for inviting us to share our views, Congressman Scott. And thank you for your leadership for many years on the child labor issues. And thank you for referencing our history with child labor. The organization that I run was really founded to eradicate child labor in the United States. We didn't quite get there, and now we see a resurgence. So I'm going to go ahead and provide my formal remarks, starting with noting that the last 2 years, Congressman Scott, Americans have been confronted with an inconvenient truth. We have a child labor epidemic in the United States. The Economic Policy Institute recently crunched Labor Department data and discovered an almost 300% increase in child labor violations since 2015. The National Consumers League, or NCL for short, the organization that I run, was founded, as I said, in 1899 during the progressive era. And one of our primary objectives was to address the epidemic of child labor in the United States. Most of us know about the Lewis Hine photos of children as young as 5, 6, and 7, working in coal mines, sleeping in heaps in gritty urban environments, threadbare, barefoot, selling newspapers, working in sweatshops, standing barefoot at looms, working in fetid, windowless tenements with family members, sewing garments for 14 hours a day. Those are the conditions under which our founders, most of them women, launched the National Consumers League. So eradicating child labor in the United States was their paramount concern, and it continues to be a paramount concern of the National Consumers League. In 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act was adopted, federal law prohibited child labor for most sectors, but agriculture was exempted. Our colleague Margaret Wurth will discuss the impact of these exemptions for the 300,000 children in the United States who today toil long hours harvesting crops in American fields. In the last 2 years, the veil has been lifted on increased levels of illegal work by children in factories. In 2011, labor investigators found teens working illegally in auto parts factories in Alabama, performing hazardous jobs. This year, the Department of Labor found 102 children, some only 12 and 13 years old, working the night shift in 13 meatpacking facilities in 8 different states. And soon after, the New York Times reporter Hannah Dreier interviewed over 100 children doing a wide variety of hazardous work in 20 different states. The response in state legislatures has been disappointing, to say the least. 10 states have undertaken legislative efforts to weaken child labor protections in 2022 and 2023 by either enacting regressive legislation or proposing such bills. The Washington Post reports that an organized campaign is underway through a right-wing think tank called the Foundation for Government Accountability. So far, 4 states have reduced protections in small or significant ways. These include New Hampshire, New Jersey, Arkansas, and Iowa. Rollbacks in several other states are on the table, and NCL and the Child Labor Coalition oppose all of these efforts to weaken child labor protections. The CLC, the Child Labor Coalition, fought an hours extension bill eventually vetoed by Governor Tony Evers in Wisconsin in 2022. We engaged with Iowa groups, including the state AFL-CIO, to try to reduce the impact of this egregiously bad bill that Governor Reynolds signed in Iowa in May. We've also sent a letter to Ohio Governor Mike DeWine if an hours extension bill going through the legislature ends up on his desk. Now, I serve as the co-chair of the Child Labor Coalition, which has 38 member nonprofit groups, all working on the front lines of efforts to protect our children. Efforts are focused on helping Congress and the states and regulatory agencies shape legislative and administrative proposals to address the widening child labor crisis. We've learned that current monetary penalties for child labor violations are insufficient in deterring child labor. DOL pointed this out in announcing the results of its meatpacking investigation in February of this year. Congress and members of this committee have responded. We are supportive of the 4 bills introduced in the 118th Congress that would raise fines for child labor violations by a factor of 10. What is now a $15,000 fine would become a $150,000 fine under most of the bills. Fines at these higher amounts passed the House in the Build Back Better bill last session. To discuss each of the bills in a little bit more detail, HR 4440, which you, Congressman Scott, and Congresswoman Adams introduced, would increase fines by a factor of 10, would establish child labor fines for the first time, invoke criminal penalties for the most egregious cases, and strengthen the Department of Labor's ability to prevent the movement and sale of products made through illegal child labor. It also has new research requirements and enables private enforcement and establishes a new National Advisory Committee on Child Labor. This bill has language that encourages the Department of Labor as well to improve occupational safety rules for children on farms, which is a priority of our Child Labor Coalition for the last dozen years. So we thank you, Congressman Scott and Congresswoman Adams, for your leadership on this very strong bill. Three other strong bills include S637, the Child Labor Prevention Act, introduced by Senator Schatz. The HR 2956, the Combating Child Labor Act, introduced by Representative Kildee, and HR 2388, Justice for Exploited Children Act, introduced by Congresswoman Schulten, which would also establish minimum child labor fines for the first time. Mr. Kildee's bill requires DOL to submit an annual child labor report that includes a summary of all child labor enforcement actions. The CLC was pleased to provide technical and subject matter support on these bills as they were drafted and has heartily endorsed all four bills, along with HR 2822, the Child Labor Exploitation Accountability Act by Representative Kesar. The bill would prevent companies from selling goods to the Department of Agriculture if those goods were produced by repeat violators of our child labor laws. Increasing funding for DOL to expand labor's inspections is critical. Wage and Hour has less than 800 investigators for 11 million workplaces and 160 million workers. That's one inspector for every 200,000 workers, which we believe is woefully inadequate, especially as we recognize the magnitude of the problem in factories and meatpacking plants. The CLC urges a goal of increasing inspectors from 800 to 1,500 over the next 5 years. We encourage staff to reach out to us at the CLC and the NCL with questions or join the campaign to end the scourge of child labor in the United States through the Child Labor Coalition. I thank you, Congressman Scott, and all members of this committee for your leadership and your effort to join us and the rest of America, who we believe strongly support controls and protections for our nation's most vulnerable workers and consumers, children under 18 years old.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Wurth.
Thank you, Congressman Scott, and distinguished members of Congress for the opportunity to speak today about the child labor crisis in the United States. I am a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, an international organization working in more than 100 countries worldwide. For decades, we've documented child labor all over the world, including in the US. And as Sally explained, an important national conversation is happening now on the harsh reality of child labor in our country. But a group of often disregarded US child workers, those working in agriculture, have been largely left out of this discussion, and they desperately need greater protection. Over the last decade, I have researched the dangerous conditions children face while working on US farms. I interviewed a 17-year-old boy who had 2 fingers sliced off in an accident with a mower, a 13-year-old girl who felt so faint while working a 12-hour shift in the heat that she had to hold herself up with a tobacco plant, an 8th grader who said his eyes itched and burned after a farmer sprayed pesticides in a field nearby. These were not isolated incidents. My colleagues and I have interviewed hundreds of child farm workers and published their accounts in 4 detailed reports. Many of them worked 12 or 14-hour days in punishing heat without breaks, without water, without access to bathrooms. Many had no safety training and no protective equipment, even though they were using sharp tools and heavy machinery. Many were exposed to toxic pesticides, and on tobacco farms, children were exposed to nicotine, a neurotoxin. To be clear, these were not children working on their own family's farms. These children were working as hired laborers, often on large commercial agribusiness operations. But unlike the stories that Sally mentioned that have made headlines recently of children working on factory floors and in meatpacking plants, almost none of the child labor abuses that we documented violated US law or regulations. they weren't violations because US laws and policies governing children's work in agriculture are far too weak. Longstanding loopholes in US labor law allow children as young as 12 to work unlimited hours on farms of any size as long as they don't miss school. In every other sector, 16 is the basic minimum employment age, and 14 and 15-year-olds can only work a few hours in certain limited occupations. US law also allows child farm workers at the age of 16 to do work that's considered hazardous by the US Department of Labor, DOL, when in any other sector, you have to be 18 to do hazardous work. So one example, workers at a deli counter can't use a meat slicer until they're 18, but on farms, children at 16 can use power-driven circular saws. This all means that if a DOL labor inspector goes to a farm today and finds a 12-year-old child working a 12-hour shift on a dangerous tobacco farm, there is no labor violation to report. Despite these dangers, DOL has not updated the list of hazardous agricultural occupations since 1970. More than 20 years ago, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health urged DOL to update that list. And back in 2011, DOL introduced new regulations, but it withdrew them in 2012 in response to pushback from ag groups. Throughout history, the US has exploited the labor of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color and their children in agriculture. The child labor exemptions for ag that remain in US law today are part of this racist legacy, and they disproportionately harm Latinx children and their families who make up the vast majority of farm workers. The national dialogue and reporting that we've seen on child labor makes it an opportune time for members of Congress to take action, and we've been really encouraged to see action from some members already, including the bills that Sally mentioned. I'll leave you with 5 recommendations before we open up for questions. Number 1, we urge you as members to co-sponsor 2 important bills that would protect child farm workers. One is the Children's Act for Responsible Employment and Farm Safety, or the CARE Act, HR 4046, led by Congressman Ruiz and Grijalva. It would raise the basic minimum age for farm work to 14 and set the hazardous work age at 18, the same protections we give to children working in every other sector. The second is the Children Don't Belong on Tobacco Farms Act, HR 4020, led by Congresswoman DeLauro and Senator Durbin. It would ban children under 18 from hired work on tobacco farms. Both of these bills exempt kids working on their own family's farms. Number 2, we ask you to urge the Department of Labor to update the narrow 50-year-old regulations governing hazardous work in agriculture and open new rulemaking on this topic. Number 3, valuable data collection efforts were stopped in recent years because of budget cuts, and we ask you to look for ways to improve research and data collection and enhance enforcement mechanisms for existing protections. Measures in Congressman Scott's new bill, the Protecting Children Act, would help the government collect better data on injuries, illnesses, and deaths among child workers. Number 4, keep occupational safety and health at the center of the conversation. So much of our research showed terrifyingly unsafe workplaces. And while these workplaces are awful for kids, they're also dangerous for adults. Ensuring occupational safety and health experts are part of efforts to tackle child labor is really key. And number 5, my last recommendation, look at what's driving child labor. A stronger legal framework cannot end child labor overnight. Everywhere, child labor is driven by poverty and economic hardship. Farm workers need a living wage so they can support their families, and workers need to be able to collectively bargain and form unions to negotiate better working conditions. We need strong social protection programs to provide relief to families experiencing economic hardship. We urge you to commit to protecting all children from exploitative and hazardous work, including those working on farms. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.